So Sam, tell us, how do we be insightful in 14 minutes?
That's a fantastic question.
Welcome to a new series, Read a Book in 14 Minutes. With our first guest, Sam Knowles, who talks about how to be insightful. So here goes. Get this book, get it in 14 minutes.
So I think that the concept of insight is a much overused concept. Or rather, the word is much overused, and it's a rather poorly understood concept. We're very good at using and overusing terms, I think, that are abstract and that are difficult to get to. The cognitive psychologist, Princeton psychologist, Daniel Kahneman, in his book Thinking Fast and Slow, says that thinking is to humans as swimming is to cats. They can do it, but they prefer not to. And we have this amazing, each one of us has this amazing cognitive architecture. We have the world's best supercomputer, the most advanced supercomputer sitting between our ears. But what we don't have really are the tools and the ability to introspect and to understand what's going on underneath the hood. And so I run a data storytelling consultancy in the UK called Insight Agents, and I deliberately called my business that 7 years ago when setting it up, because one, I think that insight is an incredibly useful, it's a profound and deep understanding of an issue, a topic, a person, a thing, and it's incredibly useful in innovating and in pivoting and in changing and in developing new ideas and products and categories. I mean, I really believe, the subtitle of the book is Unlocking the Superpower That Drives Innovation, and I genuinely believe that insight is a superpower that drives innovation, because we're all faced in this big data world. Increasing amounts of data and information. We're all faced with the challenge of how do you move from the data points that surround us that can kind of coalesce into information and observation and indeed knowledge. I think that insight is the step that comes after that, this profound and deep understanding that might ultimately lead to something as grand as wisdom and ultimately impact. We all want to have impact in the world, but in order to get there, we need to go from data to insight. And that's why, well, one, I called my business this because I'd seen the word used with such gay abandon by people who were abusing and misusing it. But then I called my business Insight Agents, because this agency is about getting your fingernails dirty and actually having a paradigm, a way of understanding how to move from data to insight. One of my analogies, I think I'm not alone in this, one of my analogies about when we get a profound and deep understanding of a person, an issue, a topic or a thing, is that the planets align. Here's an image of a set of planets rather too close. There's the Earth in the middle and other planets. But no, when the planets align, when things line up, Vilfredo Pareto, the Italian philosopher, much better known, I think, for his 80-20 rule than his observation about ideas and insights. He said that an idea is nothing more or less than a combination of old elements. And for me, that's a really profound understanding of what an insight is. I'm being I'm flipping here between the word insight and idea, you might say, perhaps with a bit too much gay abandon. But no, I think an insight is when we take data, when we are curious enough to absorb ourselves in the data that we need to make sense of a topic, an issue, a category, whatever it might be. We're curious and we take on a lot of information and we allow our brain to do its uniquely recombinatorial thing of taking old and making something new. Picasso, Steve Jobs, Oscar Wilde all talked about genius stealing. Genius stealing, I think, is really, really important. It's not just the alignment of the planets, but it's the alignment of the raw stuff of insight in our brains. It's fundamentally, it's the alignment of ideas in our brains represented neurally. Now, before we get to my model of insight, which is at the heart of my book, How to Be Insightful, I just want to take you on a short journey through maybe the history and philosophy, the psychology and the neuroscience of insight. So, from the 5th century onwards, when Socrates and his acolyte and writer-up in general, Plato, were developing their ideas, they talked a lot about. They didn't quite talk about insight, but they talked a lot about. So I've got a number of kind of Greek words here: idea, the form, the not the reality, the look or the semblance of something. So Plato, particularly in his Republic, he talks a lot about the purest forms of things that exhibit so beauty. There's this ultimate pure form of beauty, and things that are beautiful exhibit an element of the ultimate pure form. They talk a lot about Sophia, wisdom. The word philosophy, philosophia comes from that. We need to get to a place of knowledge, and knowledge requires curiosity. The Greeks called that either episteme or gnosis. They had a sense of noesis, of knowing and understanding, and then there's this fantastic word that the Greek philosophers used, which was diaretikos, which means clear sight. Now, there isn't, so far as I know, an ancient Greek word, a Greek philosopher word for insight, but in modern Greek there's a trace. Diaretikoteta is insight in modern Greek. So the Greeks thought about it. This influenced philosophy throughout, certainly throughout the Western culture. And then when we get to psychology, the psychology of it, I think some really interesting things happened. So there was a German experimental psychologist called Wolfgang Köhler, working in the late 19th, early 20th century. And Köhler demonstrated insight not only in humans, but actually in chimpanzees. So if you give familiar objects in unfamiliar circumstances to chimpanzees, in this case, sticks, boxes, and bananas, and you give them access to the tools that they could use to free the bananas, suddenly, once they've got it, they can do it again and again and again, and they go and they share it. They share it with the members of their troop, and they can teach it. And so this is a one step removed from humanity. But that, I think, is a really interesting set of experiments. The Gestalt psychologists, they were absolutely understanding. So what the Greeks had set up in philosophy, the Gestalt and experimental psychologists demonstrated. Now, what I think maybe the grandfather of insight is this guy, a guy called Graham Wallas. He was one of the founders of the London School of Economics, and he wrote a almost impenetrable, impossible to read book called The Art of Thought. And in this, he was the first of maybe 5 or 6 different people in very different schools in engineering, mathematics, psychology, throughout the 20th century, who proposed a 4-step model of insightful thinking. Now, it's almost impenetrable to read. It's got a beautiful name, The Art of Thought, but it's almost impenetrable to read. He said there were 4 stages. He said that there was that you needed to take information on. You needed to think about that information. You needed to have a breakthrough when things had joined together, and then you needed to test it. But it was, as I say, almost impenetrable, that book. But this idea came up time and time again. James Webb Young, who worked for J. Walter Thompson for the middle part of the 20th century, wrote a lovely book called A Technique for Producing Ideas, where he takes Wallace's 4-step model and adds an unnecessary 5th one. But what the Greeks had foreshadowed was beginning to be demonstrated in psychology, and then really interestingly, neuroscience. Neuroscience recently has shown these 4 steps at work. Now, 2 areas of psychology and kind of pre-neuroscience, the phrenology, the Victorian pastime that attributed different qualities and different abilities to different parts of the brain. Here we have marvelousness just at the top of the head. Of course, this was like astrology. It was kind of made up science. But we began to get towards an understanding of what happens in different parts of the brain. In part through accident and through brain injury. On the right here we see Phineas Gage, a railway worker, he's holding a tamping iron. He was using to tamp down gunpowder to blast a new railway cutting in America, and it exploded and shot straight through his head. The reason his eyes closed is because he got an injury where the tamping iron went through his head. It removed his frontal lobes, and he went from being a devout religious man to being one of the sweariest men that the doctors had met. We began to understand where things were happening. And recently, a Caltech physicist, Leonard Milodnov has helped us to understand what psychology and neuroscience, particularly from two labs, John Kunios and Mark Beeman, in the States, using fMRI and EEG, the scalp device you can see there. They've really helped to understand what happens at the moment of insight, what happens during curiosity, what happens as we're recombining stuff. They've demonstrated it all taking place within the brain. So two other books, if you're interested in this area, that I would take you to. Now, all of this, the history, philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience that I've researched and I set out in much greater detail in the course of How to Be Insightful, all of this has led me to create and to codify, because I'm a great codifier, if nothing else, to codify a way of how to be insightful, how to be more insightful. There are 4 phases, and I have this thing called the STEP Prism of Insight. It's a prism, it's a way of looking at the world, and it's STEP because that's an acronym for the 4 stages of insightful thinking. So the first is sweat, being curious, immersing yourself in the topic, but not just the topic that you need to generate an insight for, not just that topic, but actually curiosity as a state of mind, of a way of being. So the analytics that we may do, the data that we may gather, the way that we will sift and sort data and begin to subject this data in our immersion, our experience, begin to subject it to some sorting and some sifting. So sweat is the first phase. The next one, and this one causes the palace revolution often with the bosses when I'm training insightful thinking, is timeout. You get distracted, you get frustrated if you don't allow your subconscious mind the time to do its brilliant recombinatorial thing. So timeout is essential because, crucially, insight problems are not like analytical problems. They don't yield to the amount of time that you put in. So it's absolutely crucial. Even if it's just walking around the block or making a cup of tea or having a shower, going for a run, lots of different techniques that you can do to give your mind time out away from the insight problem that you're trying to solve. Then there's EUREKA. So Archimedes leaping out of his bath, he'd worked out that the king of Syracuse was being swindled and that his crowns were made of silver, not gold. That's another story. But EUREKA, you have to know what it feels like emotionally, physically, physiologically to have an insight and then to capture it. You know, I keep waterproof crayons in the shower because the shower often happens for me, many other people too. And then prove. Prove is the last. It's really essential that we test our hunches of insight and validate them and verify them as early as possible, when they're well articulated, but as early as possible. Now, insight is fundamentally about empathy. If we want a profound and deep understanding of someone or something, as Atticus Finch, the lawyer, says in the book and the film and now the play of To Kill a Mockingbird to his daughter Scout, you never really understand a person until you consider things from his and indeed her point of view, until you climb inside of his skin and walk around in it. So if you want to be insightful, I strongly recommend that you follow the codified STEP prism of insight: sweat, timeout, EUREKA, and prove, and then you will be inside the mind of the person or the group that you want to understand.
Thank you, Sam. That was brilliant.
All right.
So I'm going to stop the recording now.